Good morning. Today we're going to start talking about the information that's in Chapter 3 in your textbook, and your Chapter 3 is titled Atoms and Significant Figures. Chapter three's information first starts with dealing with the beginning parts of the atom. And so the very first thing you need to remember is that when we're talking about atoms, we're talking about the building blocks of matter. So atoms are the smallest part of what makes up everything. Okay, all of the atoms that we know about on the face of the earth are found on the periodic table. That's where it lists everything that's there. Your book in this section of chapter 3, section 3.1, that's where it starts introducing you to the first 20 elements on the periodic table, and it wants you to know everything about each one of those elements. The most important thing that you need to know about those elements is you need to be able to recognize their symbols. You should also be able to tell what their atomic numbers are. Now, the atomic number is the small whole number that is given in the box for each element. And it is that atomic number that we use to put elements in order to place them on the periodic table. Now, once we deal with these first 20 atoms, we'll deal with other atoms from the periodic table in future chapters, but it does give you that introduction where you deal with those first 20 atoms, you learn their atomic numbers and their symbols and their names. Okay, so please make sure that you go ahead and get practice with that. And then the rest of the chapter is devoted to one of the most important things that we talk about in chemistry, which is significant figures. In section 3.2, we talk about uncertainty and why we use sig figs. And so the biggest thing that you need to know is that when you are giving me your numerical answers, please make sure that you do not forget how to round. So the beginning of section 3.2 talks about your rounding rules. How do you know if you round up or round down? If you're talking about rounding to a particular place, please remember you determine whether that place stays the same or goes up by looking at the number that is immediately to the right of the number you're trying to round. Okay, and so it gives you the rules for doing that on pages 50 and 51, and then it lets you practice doing some in that practice set A. Then it moves into talking about uncertainty. What is uncertainty? And again, what that is how much we are unsure about the answer. And so, what we do in chemistry, because we want to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible, we use significant figures. And please remember that significant figures, their purpose is to limit our uncertainty. Now, when you talk about significant figures, you've got to learn what the rules for significant figures are. And so when you're writing a measurement, please remember using a measuring device, you have to write down every number that you can read from the device, and then you have to estimate the last digit. Okay, and so by definition, significant figures are all the known numbers plus one uncertain digit. So if you're measuring from a device that you can read the numbers off of, you've got to read all of those numbers that you can see from the device, and then you still have to estimate one digit beyond what you can see on the device. The next thing that's talked about in that significant figure section is using the plus or minus. The plus or minus gives you an indication of how much uncertainty there is. The bigger your plus or minus value, the more uncertainty there is. So just be careful with that. If you've got any questions on that, please reach out. In section 3.3, we go into talking about how you do calculations with significant figures. And the book starts out with what do you do when you add or subtract? Remember, when you're adding and subtracting numbers, you do have to line up the decimal points in order to add or subtract them. Once you have those decimal points lined up, you go ahead and add your number as you normally would. Once you have the answer for what it would be after you've added, then you've got to go back and look at each one of your values that you use to find the answer. And you're looking at those to see how many places behind the decimal did each one have. And when you give your answer for adding and subtracting, your answer will always have the least number of places after the decimal as the values you used. Okay, and so if there's anything more than the least number of places, you know you're going to have to round. You cannot just drop that off. Okay, now your calculator does not know the rules for significant figures. So what you're going to see as you're entering your answers in on your homework, your calculator may give you an answer, but when you enter it in SmartWork 5, if it does not have correct sig figs, SmartWork 5 is going to mark it wrong. So please make sure that you remember the rule for adding and subtracting, which is that you keep the least number of places after the decimal. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So let's say we're adding numbers. Let's say I'm adding 1.50 plus 2.479 plus 0.1134. So again, I've got to line up those decimals to add these numbers together, and then I add according to place value. So there's nothing here but a 4. 9 plus 3 is 12. 1 plus 7 plus 1 gives me 9. 5 plus 4 plus 1 is 10. So I have a 0, and I carry my 1, bring down my decimal point. 1 plus 1 plus 2 gives me 4. All right, so when I give the answer for this, when I look at my numbers, notice this first number had 2 places after the decimal. This one had 3 places after the decimal, and that one has 4 places after the decimal. So when I give my answer can only have 2 places after the decimal. All right, so what I've got to do is I count my 2 places after the decimal. I look at the number that is immediately to the right of that second place after the decimal. Remember, if it's 5 or higher, your number goes up. Well, our number is a 2, which means that my 9 has to stay the same. And so the answer that I would ultimately give would be 4.09. All right? So when you're adding and subtracting again, please remember the rule is that you keep the least number of places after the decimal. Now, next in section 3.3, your book goes on to tell you how to count your significant figures. And it even deals with how you count significant figures when you're dealing with numbers that are in scientific notation. And so you will remember it's only the coefficient that you look at to determine significant figures when your number's in scientific notation. Okay? So whatever comes in front of the times 10, that's what's going to determine how many sig figs your answers have. All right? The next thing that your book deals with is the rules for calculations when you are multiplying or dividing. And so the rules for significant figures change just a little bit when you're multiplying or dividing. And so what those rules say is that when you give your answer after multiplying and dividing, your answer must have the least number of significant figures of the numbers you use to get that answer. Okay? So if you're multiplying a number that has 2 sig figs and a number that has 4 sig figs, your answer can only have 2 sig figs. And you will have to round that in order to have the correct answer. And so if we try a problem like that, let's say I give you the numbers 4.50 times 2.0. And now you will remember, when you're multiplying, you don't line up decimals, but you do have to multiply according to place value. And you start at the right and move to the left. So when we do that, we notice 0 times all of that is going to give us all zeros on the first row. Then I move over one place. Since I'm now multiplying by the 2, 2 times 0 gives me 0. 2 times 5 is 10. I add the 0, carry the 1. 4 times 2 is 8. Plus that 1 gives me 9. And so then I just add up my digits. Now, when I'm determining where the decimal goes, please notice there are 2 places after the decimal here. There's 1 place after the decimal there. So when I add that up, that gives me 3 places after the decimal. So I need to move my decimal from the end of this number to 3 places. And so the decimal actually ends up behind the 9. So when I'm considering my significant figures, when I look at this number, this 4.50, because that 0 is at the end of the number and to the right of the decimal, it is significant. And so we know that any number that's not a 0 is always significant. So when I count sig figs for that first number, I end up with 3 significant figures in that first number. When I count sig figs in this second number, I end up with 2 significant figures there. So when I give my answer should have 2 significant figures. And so for 4.50 times 2.0, the correct answer should be 9.0 with correct sig figs. Okay? And so that rule applies when you're multiplying as well as when you are dividing. Now, your book then talks about what do you do when you have calculations that have steps or have parts. And generally, that means if the answer you find now is not the final answer to the question, what do you do? And the answer is you just keep 1 more sig fig than you actually need. So if you need 2 sig figs in your final answer, then when you get that answer, you need to write that answer down with 3 sig figs so that you can carry that to the next part. And so if you've got any questions on that, there is a calculation summary given on the bottom of page 56, going to the top of page 57. You can always reach out and let me know if you've got questions on that as well. Then the very last section in chapter 3 that's talked about is what do you do with your zeros, or if you have exact numbers, how do you know when a 0 is significant? How do you know when a 0 is not significant? The biggest thing is, remember, if you've got zeros that are in the front of a number, like you've got a really small number that has 0.0000, those zeros that are in the front, they're never going to be significant. They are never going to be significant. However, if you have zeros that are in between significant figures, then they are significant. So in the number 101, 101, that zero's in the middle of those 2 significant figures, so it is also significant. If I gave you 1001, 1001, those 2 zeros that are in the middle there, because they are between significant figures, then they are also significant. Please remember that any 0 that is at the end of the number and to the right of the decimal, just like we had in these problems here, they are always significant. So even though your calculator does not show those final zeros, they are still significant. So you've got to remember that when you're entering your answers. There may be zeros that your calculator is not showing that you need to have when you submit your answers. And then the very last one for zeros is if you have zeros that are at the end of the number, but they're not to the right of the decimal point, if they're to the left of the decimal point, then they are not significant. So in the number 2500, 2500, those last 2 zeros, they're not going to be significant. Even though they're at the end of the number, they're not significant because they are not to the right of the decimal. All right. And then your book finally moves into exact numbers, and the fact that anytime you have an exact number, it has an infinite number of sig figs. And so you cannot use that exact number to tell you how many sig figs your answer should have. All right. Your review quiz for chapter 3 starts on page 60 and goes to page 61. The answers for that quiz are on page 62. Please try that out before you get your homework done. If you've got any questions about any of that, please make sure you bring it to our Collaborate session. I look forward to seeing you the next time. I hope you have a great rest of your day.